Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. We are going to go through the results of the midterm elections, not so much on a state by state basis, but the overall impact of them. That's what we're going to talk about. Surprises there. And our guest is Rich Rubino, who is a political historian, political analyst, and author. We'll talk about his books later. But I guess the big surprise was that the anticipated red wave never really materialized to the degree they thought it would. And of course, that says a great deal. And we're going to find out maybe what it says as we speak to Rich. Hi, Rich.
Hi, Bradley. Thanks so much for having me on this post-election day.
So I'd like to talk, as I mentioned, about the big picture on this and maybe what it says about what the real important issues were compared to what folks thought the real issues were, how the election deniers did, how this bodes for Trump, how this bodes for 2024. 1, 2, 3, go, Rich.
Okay. Well, the first thing, so generally speaking, the party in power loses on average, this is since World War II, of 26 seats in the House of Representatives. The most the parties ever lost was 113 back in 1894 when Grover Cleveland was president. So this is what's interesting. This is where it's almost unprecedented. You have a president of the United States, a Democrat, whose job approval rating is in the low 40s. This should have been essentially a wave for Republicans. By contrast, Bill Clinton in 1994 had a job approval right around 46%. His Democratic Party lost about 54 seats in the House, and the first time in 40 years, the Republicans took hegemony over the House of Representatives. And if you look at 1946, the Democratic Party lost about 54 seats, the most they've lost since 1894. But here's why the most they've lost since Franklin Roosevelt, rather, in 1938. But here's why that's interesting, because in 1946, there were very similar circumstances. There were certainly issues about inflation. For example, President Harry S. Truman had job approval right around where Joe Biden was. But the party still lost seats. They lost the House and they lost the Senate. So the question has to be, why is it different this time with the president unpopular, with inflation soaring, with at least the perception being very gloomy amongst the American people, although some of the Democratic Party would point to deficit reduction and point to job increases. But just let's go by what the perception is.
Right. You would think the prevailing situation would favor a red wave, especially with inflation, increasing worries about crime, and that sort of thing.
And in 94, by the way, you had a very similar. You had crime was a big issue. You had Bill Clinton signing the ban on AK-47s, and you had his tax increase. And as a result, the party lost. So what's different this time? First of all, in 2018, there were a bunch of moderate and conservative Democrats who got elected in swing districts in the anti-Trump wave. That in 2020, all things being equal, they lost their reelection bids. As a matter of fact, last time around, with the exception of Colin Peterson in Minnesota, who represents a district that went 31 points for Donald Trump, every single person on the Democratic side who lost was a freshman. So that just means there are just very few actual congressional districts that are competitive. When Donald Trump, Joe Biden last election, of the 435 congressional districts, only 16 of them went for a different member of Congress than they voted for their presidential race. For example, in Northern Maine, voted for Jared Golden, Democrat, but voted for Donald Trump, Republicans. There are just very few districts that are actually competitive. Now, you add to that the fact that Donald Trump continues to be essentially on the political scene, and he also has a job approval rating and a personal approval rating under 50%. So as a result, you have him kind of in the background. But you also have the scenario, and Mitch McConnell talked about this a couple of months ago. He's at the Louisville Chamber of Commerce, and they asked him, will Republicans take control of the Senate? He talked about candidate quality issues, meaning that all things being equal, some of these Republican candidates should have won. In a state like Pennsylvania, for example, if they had nominated somebody else, someone who's more establishment, perhaps that seat would have they would have been actually able to hold that seat, for example. But they nominated, or New Hampshire. They nominated Dan Baldwin. They nominated a candidate who is seen as kind of anti-establishment Republican. He actually changed his views in the election the day after he was actually nominated in the primary. But Dan Bullock was seen as perhaps too militant or too conservative for New Hampshire, which is kind of a very purple state. As a result, Maggie Hassan, who's not particularly popular, was able to actually be victorious in that state, and she won relatively significantly. So basically, it's an amalgamation of having candidates who were the Republicans in some cases nominated their weakest possible candidate in the primaries, and the other candidates who can have very good in terms of appealing to the base, but could not appeal to a broad cross-section of constituencies, including independents and weak members of the other party. And you have the fact that Donald Trump is still a divisive figure, and he's able to galvanize not only his own base, but he's able to galvanize the base of the other party who came out kind of despite Donald Trump, as opposed to the individual Republican or Democratic candidates. And the other lesson is Newt Gingrich started this essentially in 94. There are very few races that are decided on local issues. Very rarely can a candidate say, I'm on the appropriations committee. Look what I got for the community college. Look what I forgot for fishermen in our district. Look what I got for research on the right wheel, whatever it is. Now it's essentially, it's Republican or Democrat, and whatever you do for your district is almost tertiary or secondary.
So what does it say about the election deniers? There were a lot of them. There were a lot running. How did they make out?
It's a mixed bag. Some of them, I think, actually, I mean, and I don't think that was really a main issue for why they won or they lost. A lot of them come from very conservative districts. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, running in Northwest Georgia, is not going to lose that seat, for example. And there were some exceptions. For example, Massachusetts, Jeff Dale, the former state representative who had questioned the election. It wasn't really a flagship issue, and every time they asked him about it, he immediately talked about local issues and talked about how he was against how he had opposed increasing the gas tax, that type of thing. But in some cases, that he was kind of an anomaly because he was running in a very liberal state, and he was obviously too conservative for a state that only has 9% Republican registration. So generally speaking, this was very much a secondary issue, and most of the people who were who questioned the election of 2020 were either in districts that they had no chance of winning, or they were in districts in state where essentially winning the primary is tantamount to the election.
There's been a perception that younger demographics are apathetic. How did that pan out this time? Is there a way to know that yet?
Not really. The closest I can think of is there was a 25-year-old who just won a seat, Val Deming's former seat, by the way, the youngest member of the United States Congress. But I don't know if we actually have perceptions in terms of how younger voters actually turned on this election.
And what does this say about 2024?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, so Ron DeSantis no longer has this problem of will you serve all your full term. He handled it. He had one debate with Charlie Crist, and in that one debate, the candidates were not allowed to ask questions. So Charlie Crist used his time and asked a question anyway of Ron DeSantis and said, will you agree to serve out your full term? And Ron DeSantis essentially, he made a line. He said, the only donkey I want to put out to pasture is Charlie Crist, and got an applause from his adherents. But that was it. So he no longer has to worry about kind of being, saying, well, I want to focus on being governor of Florida. Now, essentially, he can focus on running for president, and lieutenant governor can do a lot of the work that he's doing as governor of Florida. It also, I think, there's a couple of precedents for this. Thomas E. Dewey in 1946 won overwhelmingly in New York State, which was kind of a purple state at the time. He used that to become the front runner for 1948 to say, look how well I did in New York. And Texas, George W. Bush in 1998, and he was asked during a debate with his opponent, Land Commissioner Gary Morrow, he said, will you serve out your full term? He says, well, I think voters need to think about the possibility that I might run for president. He was ahead by 40 points. He wins by 68% of the vote, wins overwhelmingly, and goes all over the country saying, look how well I did in Texas. I beat Ann Richards in 1994 by about 10 points. Then look how well I did in my re-election. Look at the difference between 94 and 1998. This shows that I can appeal to Hispanic voters. I can appeal to female voters. He won 25% of African-American voters, 60% of female, 49% of Latino voters in that 1998 race. So you know what? Ron DeSantis can now do the same thing. And this is a line he can use if he runs for president. He can now say, Hillary Clinton won Miami-Dade County by about 29 points. I became the first Republican since Jeb Bush in 2002 to win the overwhelmingly Latino Miami-Dade County. This shows that if you nominate me for president in 2024 in the general election, I can appeal to a broad cross-section of constituencies, not just base conservative Republicans.
Yeah, I would think it would have a huge impact on the race in terms of whether or not Trump runs. Trump's in a bind now because he really hates to lose. That's his kryptonite. The prospect of losing, it just overrides everything. Huge, hot fear for him, and of course the fact that DeSantis did so well makes it a little more likely that he would lose if he ran. On the other hand, he doesn't want to get indicted, and he's less likely to get indicted if he's an active candidate, right? So this has got to be difficult for him.
Well, he's still the preponderant. You got to remember, despite what happened last night, he's still the preponderant front runner. And the last poll shows him at about 71%. And obviously, he's at his high watermark, and that's going to come down. And Ron DeSantis certainly was not the only candidate who would challenge him in a primary. There's certainly going to be some anti-Trump Republicans. Perhaps Larry Hogan, the outgoing governor of Maryland, might lead that charge. Congresswoman Cheney, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, former Congressman Bill Hurd. And there might be a few other candidates as well, but most of them, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, for example, was getting out. Kristen Noem from governor of North Dakota will probably not run if Trump runs. But so the worst possible scenario, by the way, would be just him against Ron DeSantis, because then you have, do you support Donald Trump or do you not support Donald Trump? I don't think this is really going to have any bearing. Now, it's true he does not like losing. And when he was thinking, there are many times he thought about running. In 2000, he was going to run as a centrist for the Reform Party nomination, but then basically said the party had gone too far to the right and he dropped out. 2012, he talked about he was seriously considering running and he didn't. 2016, he saw his aperture and he ran that year and he actually won. And he does not like losing. I think, obviously he still says that he won the 2020 presidential election, but obviously he does not. Obviously he has a message and he sees himself as being, when you see yourself at 71%, it's hard to say you're not necessarily going to run. It looks like he's going to make an announcement within the next few days that he will be an active candidate for president.
All right. I would have thought that DeSantis is doing so well that it would give him second thoughts, but you don't think so?
No, I don't think that. I think he still sees himself. He still sees himself well ahead of the pack. And if you listen to what he said just yesterday, he basically said, "I know more about Ron DeSantis than anybody, other than perhaps his wife." Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think also, in terms for a personal motivation, remember, Ron DeSantis was not the front runner in 2018 for the Republican nomination. The Agriculture Commissioner, Adam Putnam, was. Donald Trump endorses Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis wins the primary, then wins re-election by well under 1% of the vote. So Donald Trump, I think, thinks to himself, look, I kind of made this guy. This guy would be a former congressman from Florida, probably in the private sector now, if it was not for my endorsement. And now this guy decides he's going to run for this guy might run for president, even if I'm in the race. I think he's certainly kind of inflamed by that. And I did not see a scenario where he says, well, I'm going to essentially let Ron DeSantis become the preponderant front runner in the race.
So about the issues that turned out to be important, my big issue is threats to democracy, because if the system's gone, then all the other things don't matter. How did that fare in this election? How
we don't know yet.
Other...
In terms of issue by issue, obviously a threat to democracy is something that is not necessarily something that envelopes the day-to-day lives of the American people. They're more
abstract, pretty abstract for some people. That's true.
For a lot of people, I think, yes, in terms of what they're thinking about in terms of issues. Obviously the economy is usually the tantamount issue unless the country is in a military intervention or something to that effect, or there's a huge scandal or something. But generally speaking, those issues are kind of subservient. But that being said, there were some people who, like Lori Boebert, for example, who very few people thought was actually going to lose her congressional district, who is now in a virtual dead heat. She's in a virtual tie. And she was somebody who had certainly many believe was somebody who had supported the protests at the Capitol. Trying to be politically correct here, whether you call it a protest, insurrection, but what happened on January 6th. So there are some Republicans who have lost who were seen as kind of the voice of the insurrectionist, if you will. If she's lost, I don't know if she has yet.
Are you surprised about the results in Pennsylvania?
No, that really could have gone either way. I think it was so close, and I think in that case, the Democrats probably dodged a bullet. This is the case, by the way. Senator Pat Toomey is not running for re-election. Conservative Republican senator who voted for the impeachment of Donald Trump. The Republicans nominated Dr. Oz, who had the endorsement of Donald Trump in the primary. And then during the primary, he was very good at staying on message. Every time in a debate, if they asked him what kind of car he drives, he's going to say, "I have the endorsement of Donald Trump." He barely eked out a victory in that primary. He was probably a weaker candidate than some of the other candidates. On the other side, John Fetterman was probably a weak candidate as well. He had supported Bernie Sanders in 2016 over Hillary Clinton, even though Hillary Clinton absolutely wiped out Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary in the state of Pennsylvania. Connor Lamb, the congressman, more conservative Democrat veteran who had won a special election a few years ago, was probably a more formidable candidate to win that seat. But in this case, both candidates, all things being equal, again, ceteris paribus, both parties nominated their weakest possible candidate, and essentially, it could really that race really could have gone either way. I will say that the fact that John Fetterman participated in that debate, where you could see that he had a stroke and he was certainly having some mental problems at the time, certainly was not a hindrance in terms of costing him this election.
Let's kind of finish up with Georgia and how the whole thing may hinge on how that pans out.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Georgia is the only state in the union where you need a runoff for a Senate election. Essentially, if no candidate garners 50% of the vote, then you're going to have another election and a runoff. We started that last time when in the case of Georgia, where both Senate seats were up because Paul Coverdell, a Republican, had retired earlier because of illness. So essentially, they vote. So in this case, Raphael Warnock was elected to serve out the remainder of that term. Now he won in the runoff. John Ossoff won what was a full term. Was a full 6-year term. Now to serve the remainder of that term, he won. It looks like it's probably going to go to a runoff. That's because there's a Libertarian in the race, Chase Oliver, and because Chase Oliver was in that race, neither candidate looks like garnered 50%, so it could very well go, and it could very well, as I said like a couple of weeks ago, determine the outcome of the election. Interestingly, though, on the Republican side for governor, Brian Kemp, who Donald Trump wanted to challenge the results of the election, he did not. Donald Trump then recruited a candidate to run against him in the primary. That candidate, David Perdue, the former United States Senator, who actually lost in one of the runoffs to Congressman Ossoff last time around, lost in the primary. Trump did not campaign for Kemp. Trump was very hostile toward Kemp, but Trump's hostility, ironically, probably benefited Kemp running for governor because it shows him having a little bit of independence. So the question is, could he then bring over Herschel Walker, the Senate candidate, over the finish line? But Herschel Walker underperformed and Brian Kemp probably overperformed. So it looks like now that could be ground zero for the next month or so.
So who does a reset favor? In any battle, a halt in hostilities favors one side or the other. Who does this favor? Does it give Walker's opponents more time to beat down on him? Or are there other factors?
Yeah, and I mean, Walker's going to do the same thing, by the way, his people will certainly do the same thing against Raphael Warnock. Basically, you're going to have the same election just without a Libertarian, and the Libertarian, siphoning off that small percentage, about 1.9 right now percent of the vote. So
from whom? Excuse me.
We don't know where his support actually came from. I'll say, generally speaking, if you look at the Libertarian vote, it comes from the right. Now, that being said, and this comes from the Green Party too, there are always some people who are going to support the third option because they don't like either of the other two candidates, so it's a protest vote. And you probably have some people on the left who are voting Libertarian because they like the Libertarians' message of being non-interventionist on foreign policy, for the legalization of drugs, supporting personal liberty. But my guess is it probably took more votes than Republicans. By the way, you also probably have some people who would not have voted either way because they don't like either of the candidates, but they like the fact that there was a Libertarian on the ballot. But my guess is it probably takes more votes from Herschel Walker than it did Raphael Warnock.
So I was very worried about folks not accepting the results of the election. Are you hearing, is that fading away? Is that worry fading away? Or are you hearing signs that may be still a thing? It would be so nice if we could get back to normal and the respect for the process. I'd feel a lot better about everything if that were the case.
Well, in the last three elections, you go back to 2016, there were certainly Hillary supporters who said that Vladimir Putin had rigged the election. Who had rigged the election with Donald Trump. Then in 2018, in the last Georgia's governor's race, there were some who believed that Stacey Abrams really won. And then in the last race in 2020, Donald Trump himself and certainly many of his tribunes around the country believe that Donald Trump actually won the election. So we're at a time in terms of election integrity where there are a lot of people, an unhealthy number of people perhaps, who believe that the election process is essentially rigged. Perhaps the best thing they could do was actually be to try to be to ask if they could be a poll worker, and then you actually kind of see the process going. You can see kind of, but obviously there's certainly people are very incredulous and they have every right to be there incredulous about the system. I don't know kind of where we go from here, but I'll say that,
being incredulous is one thing, but refusing to accept the results, like some of the Republican candidates said they would. They said, a couple of them at least said, if I don't win, I won't believe the results.
And you're seeing sort of that scenario in Arizona right now in the gubernatorial election. I don't really know where you kind of go from there. If somebody's going to say that they don't accept the results, I don't know what the answer is to that. But I think both sides certainly are in that scenario. And by the way, every time you have a really close, razor thin election, somebody from the other side is going to come over and they're going to say, essentially, I believe that our candidate really won.
Saying I believe is one thing, but refusing to accept is another. I think the only thing you can do, well, potentially you could put legal stops in place, but political punishment. The American people have to punish those who would tear down the system, and that includes the most important pillar we have, the sanctity of the elections.
In 2000, Al Gore, after 36 days, the Supreme Court ruled essentially that the Florida recount was unconstitutional, and by a 5-4 vote, essentially installed George W. Bush as president. Al Gore gave a speech in Nashville and basically said, while I strongly disagree with the results, with the Supreme Court by their decision, I accept it, and I'm going to go back to Tennessee and mend some fences. But when that happened, there were still many on the Democratic Party who still believe that the election, that George W. Bush lost that election. If you go to the actual, when you have the actual counting of the votes, and interestingly, Al Gore was sitting up there in his capacity as president of the Senate, announcing that George W. Bush had won the presidency. And there were some members of the Democratic Party who were getting up and saying, we want to challenge this, but under the Constitution, you need to have a member of the House of Representatives and a member of the United States Senate agree to challenge it. In this case, there were members of the House of Representatives, Maxine Waters being one from California, Cynthia McKinney being another one from Georgia, who got up there and said, we just want to say that we support challenging the results. But there was nobody in the United States Senate who would step up as well. And Al Gore would essentially, in a very polite way, said the rules do care, and basically says, I can see that election.
Okay. One more question. I thought I was done, but one more question. So a big red wave was to be seen as a victory for the power of Donald Trump. Does this lack of a red wave signal the opposite?
Yes, it does. It signals that Donald Trump recruited many candidates who appeal very much to the base, but could not appeal beyond the Trump base. And that's the problem. Politics, and very much is like mathematics. You have to be able to appeal to your own base. And obviously, if you're in Marjorie Taylor Greene in your district and you're in Rome, Georgia, whoever the Republican nominee is whoever the Republican nominee is going to win that election, you could go as far right as potentially you want to go. But in some other states, you have to, in order to win, you have to certainly consolidate your own base, but you also have to appeal to a broad cross-section of constituencies, including independents and disaffected members of the other party. And in the case of places like New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, that did not happen. Now, in some states, North Carolina, for example, Donald Trump endorsed Ted Budd over Patrick McGrory, a former governor of the state. And Ted Budd, kind of a mega Republican, won the primary. Then he relatively comfortably won the general election. So, not all Trump candidates lost, but I think the one kind of saving grace for the Republican Party, and it's more symbolic, is the chairman of the Congressional Campaign Committee, Patrick Maloney. This is the guy who's fourth in line to be Speaker of the House in his own congressional district. Now, if you remember, part of his congressional district, because of the gerrymandering, became a lot of it was a district he no longer represented. But the point is, he was going around the country campaigning for other Democrats, and the thought of potentially he could be a Speaker of the House someday. It looks like he actually lost his own seat. This is the first time that I remember chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has lost their own seat since Mike Gorman lost in California in 1980, and that was because of an anti-busing activist and just kind of a weird amalgamation of scenarios. But this is fascinating. So there's a possibility that the Democrats could say, we stopped the red wave because of our chairman of the Democratic National Campaign Committee knew how to give the money, knew how to allocate, knew who to support. Meanwhile, the chairman of the Democratic Congressional House Campaign Committee actually lost his seat. Amazing.
Well, Rich, I really appreciate you giving us a lowdown the day after the midterm elections. Before we go, I want to remind folks about your books. Your books are so cool. Can you tell them about your books and where to get them? I love the books. Go ahead.
Sure. I have the Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics, the Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics, Made Every Vote Equal, When a Novel Idea, American Politics on the Rocks, and my latest is the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids. You can certainly get them on Amazon. Just Google my name, Rich, and then R.U. Rubino or politics or author, and that'll all certainly come up.
Also, you speak at events and for organizations here and there.
Yes.
How do people contact you to do that?
Yes, absolutely. You can just go to Facebook and just type in Rich and then the last name Rubino. It's a picture of me holding up the book. Go there and friend me. I can certainly, or go to Twitter and go to Rich Rubino POL, or even Instagram and Rich Rubino MHD. But I'm definitely out there, and I certainly love to speak at any events about kind of the political scene, if you will.
And Will Lyons points out Rich's commentary is better than most of the major media network commentators, which is so true. Great guest. Very
Thank
true.
You, Will. Thank you, Will.
And so if anybody from a major network happens to be watching this, no, seriously, Rich is available as a guest for those as well. That's I'm not kidding. I guess that's it. Well done. Make sure you share it, folks. I'm going to share the heck out of this because it was so great. Rich Rubino is going to share the heck out of it. That matters. If anybody really wants to help us, join large political Facebook groups and share it to these groups, like groups of 100,000, 50,000. There are big groups out there. And that would be something you could really do for me and for Rich. So take care, Rich, and we'll talk to you real soon.
Thank you so much for having me on. I greatly enjoyed it.
Okay. Bye now.